Shalom and welcome to this week's Middle East Report. On this programme today we'll be marking the 75th anniversary of the forgotten Jewish refugees from the Middle East and North Africa. Warm welcome to the programme, and today's special guest is all the way from North London. Her name is Michelle Huberman from Harif. Michelle, warm welcome to the Middle East Report.
Great to be here again, Simon. Thank you very much for having me.
It's a pleasure. Sorry it's been so long since your last on, but it's great to have you back on the programme, particularly as we talk about the forgotten Jewish refugees from the Middle East and North Africa. But before we unpack that, can you share something about your remarkable kind of Jewish history and something about your Jewish family?
Well, I actually come from quite a traditional London Jewish family, most of whom came over in the 1880s. However, on my maternal grandmother's side, they actually came in 1640 from Holland, and we have a history of this side, the Ellis side of the family, believed originally to be Elias. The name was changed along the way. That thick, it's like the old phone directories, and it really charts the history of the Jews in England. Actually, it's fascinating when you just look at it. I was tempted to bring it, but we'd never do this programme because you'd be sidetracked, because it's so fascinating. And when I actually did my DNA, I found that I had 7% Moroccan Jewish, which was really fascinating because, number one, I've always been fascinated with Moroccan Jewry, and I've been there zillions of times and have this very strong feeling for the country. But finding it in my DNA, and I think it's come from that side because the Jews of Spain, before that, they actually crossed over from Morocco. That was one of the routes after the expulsion in Roman times, moving across North Africa, Morocco to Spain. So I'm presuming that's where that part comes from.
That's an incredible heritage, dating back to 1640, particularly with the Crown Protectorate Oliver Cromwell, who brought the Jewish people back after the expulsion by Edward I in 1290. So absolutely incredible. And can you just share with us something about your Jewish childhood growing up in North London? What was that like?
Should I tell you, it was very interesting. I grew up like everybody else, and went to Hebrew classes, learnt Hebrew, which I can't speak, but I can read it with a certain accent, which everybody else has. And it was, funnily enough, the change for me, the big shift was when I went in my early 20s to live in Paris, and I was in the fashion business then, and the fashion business in Paris was mostly Jews from North Africa, from Morocco, from Tunisia, and it was a totally different culture to what I grew up with. They had different festivals, different food, there was no gefilte fish, there was nothing that I knew. And I learned a whole new culture, which I loved. I absolutely loved it. And I still, to this day, hold those very good memories which influence my work at Harif.
So what is it that attracts you to the culture and the traditions of what is known as the Sephardi Jewish community, that from the East, from North Africa and the Middle East?
Very difficult to pinpoint, but I do feel very comfortable within these communities. I love working with them for Harif. I love organising their weddings for them. It's a lovely culture. It's had a massive influence in Israel because today, over 50% of the population in Israel have come from North Africa and the Middle East, and they've got different customs, which when they first came over were suppressed. and seen as primitive, whereas now they're the dominant culture, and so you have these amazing weddings, the pre-wedding party, the henna, and it's a whole new culture that's taking over. It's actually shaping the state of Israel, the whole culture, the food, the music. It's very important.
Amazing. And Michelle, can you also share with us how you got involved with Israel advocacy and how you've got such a huge passion to highlight the plight of the forgotten Jewish refugees, not only of the Middle East, but also of North Africa?
I just grew up with a sixth sense about it. And I do remember very strongly in my teenage years, there was the plight of the Jews in Syria, which they couldn't leave the country, and I was very taken by this. And I remember in my art class at school making posters and getting all my friends to go and sit outside the Syrian embassy. I remember those posters, "Let my people go." Whereas most of my friends were like demonstrating, my Jewish friends, for Russian Jews to be released. But I had this thing about the Middle East. I mean, if you came into my home, it's all Middle Eastern. I'm very passionate about the Middle East and North Africa.
Wonderful. And Michelle, do you want to also share with us what Harif is as an organisation, and what's the kind of remit of what you...
We're there to promote the history and culture of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. And it's something in this country particularly, and in the West, in America, it's not really talked about because they've always been a minority. So it's very much a dominant Ashkenaz culture, sort of Central Europe, Eastern Europe. All of those cultures have been, you know, when you watch films and you're seeing with American films, Jewish culture, it's very much this European, Eastern European culture, whereas we're there to promote the other half of Jewry, which is the Sephardi and Mizrahi communities. And so that's what we do at Harif. We want to make sure that their culture is known about, that it's not lost, it's preserved. So at Harif, we're always doing different events. Lots, since lockdown, are online now on Zoom, and if you subscribe to our mailing list, you get the information. And we've got an international audience now.
Wonderful. So let's have a look at this video that really does show the excellent work being done by Harif to raise awareness of the plight of the Jews from the Middle East and North Africa.
For almost 3,000 years, Jews lived in the Middle East and North Africa.
أبجد هوس حطي كلمه شكل الأستاذ بقى منسجم أبجد.
Leila Murad, she was the diva, the Barbara Streisand, if you will, of the Middle East.
The Jews who were born in the Middle East and North Africa, they always had these celebrations. It brings lots of luck.
أهلاً وسهلاً أهلاً بيكم رحتوا قاربي فرح بكم زيتوا يا حبابي يا محلى اليوم أهلاً وسهلاً أهلاً بيكم.
$850,000 refugees driven from their homes.
this is something that's being revived. It's something that's happened really for hundreds of years.
Harif, preserving the history and culture of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa, advocating for minority rights, fighting for justice for the forgotten refugees.
We don't only commemorate and focus on and recognize consciously the plight of our people, we celebrate the life of our people.
Harif, setting the record straight.
And that gives you an overview of the organisation that is Harif, looking into the plight of the forgotten Jewish refugees from the Middle East and North Africa, as well as celebrating their culture, tradition, and also incredible history as well. Michelle, before we unpack a little bit more about the plight of the forgotten Jews from the Middle East as we mark its 75th anniversary, recently you got involved in a programme where you signed up for the IDF. And I read the article in the Jerusalem Chronicle prior to this program. I thought it was excellent. So we have a few pictures of you when you volunteered for the Israeli Defence Force, and I'm sure this will encourage so many of our viewers. And personally, this is something that I would love to do. But just explain to us what your experience was like being part of the IDF.
Oh, it was fantastic. I'm a very hands-on person. I don't mind getting myself dirty and what have you. You're there basically to relieve the soldiers so they get on with the important tasks. We had to sort out the rucksacks for the reservists, make sure that everything was there, that they all had the correct sizes, that the trousers matched the shirts. It was very monotonous work as such, but it was great fun, and you were very conscious that you were doing an important role. You were releasing the soldiers so that they didn't have to do all of the menial work. So, and great team of people. I loved it, and I'm going back again.
Fantastic, fantastic. So do you ever think that they might call you up?
Oh, I hope so. I doubt it. But I do have that regret. I always regret that I never went into the IDF when I was younger. I wanted to, but I got married the first time very young, and then I went to live in France. So it never happened. But this is a great way now to help the IDF.
Wonderful, wonderful. So back to talking about the Jews from North Africa and the Middle East. Can you just talk a little bit about the history? Because we're talking going back to thousands of years. We're talking about going back to the time of King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem, and the time of the book of Daniel with Daniel and the others is detailed with that Babylonian invasion of the modern state of Israel. Of course, you have Isaiah as well, and these kind of books in the Old Testament. But share with us how old the Jewish community of North Africa and the Middle East is.
Well, it's over 3,000 years old, and you've got different dispersions. You've got the destruction of the first temple to Babylon. You've got the Roman times, and for me, how I understand it, I swear by Martin Gilbert's Jewish History Atlas. I'm a very visual person, and I can get the facts, and I look at all of the maps, and I can see all the arrows of this community going here in this century, and then a century later they've moved across to Spain, and they've moved after Spain up to France and crossed over. You know, basically some people went right, some people went left, you know, after going off to the Babylonian Mesopotamia area. You know, they went up to Ukraine. You know, people just think, oh, these Jews, they come from Poland and that's it. They don't realize their history's not there. But when you actually look at our history, for me, in maps, and I can sort of see the directions of how people actually did end up in Ukraine, in Poland, in Russia, you realize we're all one people. It's not actually, and these divisions, and although we're there to preserve the history, the actual terms, Sephardi, Mizrahi, I don't think will be around in another generation because of the intermarriage between the communities, between the Ashkenaz communities. I think that's going to disappear because we're a big melting pot, and we may have come from different corners, but you know, you may have a grandfather from Poland or from Morocco, but we're all the Jewish people.
No, absolutely. But I mean, the history of the Sephardi people is one that's not largely told or not largely known.
Absolutely.
And also the fact that you have such a, this community has such a biblical heritage as well, which is incredible. I mean, you just read the book of Esther, which is the incredible story of Esther becomes the queen of Persia, and the incredible Jewish community there as well. So we're talking about traditions and history that date back thousands of years, that even predates Islam as well. So you can really say that the Sephardi Jews are the indigenous people of the Middle East and North Africa.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And the fact that we've got this distinct DNA, the fact that we all as Jews have a very distinct DNA.
Excellent. And of course, all of this changed, didn't it? These 3,000 years of history changed about 75 years ago when the modern state of Israel was declared. David Ben-Gurion took that very courageous and brave decision to declare independence, knowing that Israel would be invaded by 5 Arab armies after the British mandate expired. And then we see the process of incredible persecution against the Jews of North Africa and the Middle East, particularly when we look at Iraq, particularly one, Egypt, another, and these ancient Jewish communities that help build modern day Iraq, they help build Egypt as well. So just share with us what the trauma that these Jewish communities would have gone through.
The trauma and the fear, and not knowing, you know, with understanding what had happened during the Holocaust and knowing that their people had been persecuted, had been literally murdered, not knowing what was coming next. Plus this dream of next year in Jerusalem that has gone for 3,000 years, through all of our generations. We've always dreamt about it. And that was amazing because there was this persecution, there was this fear, but at the same time, there was a miracle happening. There was an absolute miracle happening. Declaration, the State of Israel. Nobody could have imagined in all of their dreams that this would actually happen. People were comfortable in their lives. You know, they weren't ready to leave and go, but with the various wars at different times, whether it was in 48 with Iraq, whether it was in 56 with Egypt, people were chucked out. Their passports were stamped with a one-way, never to return, to sign over all your properties, to leave your homes behind. Those are battles that are still going on. I mean, the amount of property that was lost across the Middle East and North Africa is unbelievable. I mean, I can't even think of the zillions, the actual statistics, but it's there on our website, on the Harif website. And it's much, much more than the Palestinian losses. It's at least 10 times more, but I think it's probably 100 times more because there were large swathes of land that were in southern Syria. I mean, these were very big Jewish populations, and land also owned by the JNF that were just lost.
Also businesses as well.
Businesses, everything, absolutely everything. You're given a few days to leave. You just, one suitcase, you can't take more than one suitcase per person. How do you decide? How do you decide what to take? When I was in Israel recently, I went to the Babylonian Museum. It was amazing, and they had this exhibition of suitcases there showing the Mabarot camps when people arrived, and they might have lived in these beautiful homes with servants and everything, and they arrived and they were in tents in the desert with their suitcases, and it was very powerful, you know, seeing these actual original suitcases. And how could you decide?
And also share with us the numbers involved as well. Because we're talking in the region, aren't we, in the region of 850,000?
Yes, it's about, I think it's 856,000, something like that. About 650,000 went to Israel. The others went to the West mostly. A lot of Jews from North Africa went to France, went to Canada, America. It depended where they had links, and it also depended on passports. You know, not everybody could get a European passport.
So let's have a look at this excellent CBN news report that looks into the forgotten Jews of the Middle East and North Africa.
For thousands of years, Jewish communities thrived throughout the Middle East. But all that changed in 1948, when Muslim nations reacted violently to Israel's birth.
Jews of Middle Eastern and North African descent, almost 900,000 of these Jews were exiled forcibly from their homes throughout the Middle East and North Africa when the State of Israel was founded.
After the 1967 Six-Day War, another wave of persecution hit and forced most of the remaining Jews to leave 11 Middle Eastern and North African countries. Linda Munichen became one of those refugees.
Nobody would want anything with the Jews, especially with the incitement going on the radio, in the mosques. So we were labeled like the fifth column. Also, more constraints were put, like you couldn't take out from your own account from the bank more than 100 dinars a month.
In 1970, Munichen and her brother left Baghdad for Israel, keeping their flight secret from their father, a prominent lawyer.
We didn't even kiss goodbye because I thought we'll meet one day. Anyway, I had to run away through Iran.
They escaped into the unknown.
I was disguised like an Arab with an eye looked, and my brother bought a very old coat. It was very cold winter. And to our big luck, everything went smoothly because at the time Jews were not allowed to be away from home more than 80 or 100 kilometers.
Examples like this happen all across the Middle East. Expulsions, seizure of property, and murder of the Jews.
In the aftermath of the Six-Day War in 1967, the mob in Libya, especially in Tripoli and Benghazi, took to the streets and started burning the homes of Jewish people and ransacking our warehouses. And my father's warehouse was burned. And then they came along and started pouring gasoline around my house. And a Muslim neighbor came down from the building and convinced the mob that the Jewish family wasn't living there anymore. And of course, he saved our lives.
American Gina Waldman started MENA, Jews indigenous to the Middle East and North Africa.
And I always felt that there was a sense of injustice, that even though we really made a good life for ourselves in whichever country hosted us, nonetheless, we were never recognized for the wrongs that were done to us.
2/3 of the Jewish refugees resettled in Israel and the rest in other Western countries. Waldman and Munichen both say they were traumatized. Munichen says there's a message for the Western world today.
850,000 Jews were expelled or forced to leave or persecuted from Arab countries. And when we try to overlook these issues, they come again in a different way.
For Israel, sharing the saga of Jewish refugees is part of gaining international recognition for their sufferings.
And we say, well, there are two sets of refugees. There are Jewish refugees and there are Arab refugees, and both sides should be compensated together.
Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
And it's such an important story that we can't actually forget, and we should do all we can to raise awareness of what happened to the plight of the Jews from North Africa and the Middle East as we mark its 75th anniversary. I have to ask you, why do you think this is a story that's not very well known? We all, and I'll go in a bit later and talk about, we all know about the kind of Palestinian Arab refugee crisis because this is constantly dominated in our news, but we see that more Jewish people from the Middle East and North Africa had to leave their homes, and yet silence. It's like it never happened.
Yeah, a lot of criticism to the Israeli government on this, that for years it just wasn't talked about. The culture was very Ashkenaz-centric. It's shifted. For 9 years now, there's been a day in the Jewish calendar, 30th of November, which we definitely at Harif commemorate. It's commemorated in Israel to celebrate and commemorate Jews from the MENA countries. And it needs to be out there all the time, because yeah, people talk about Palestinian refugees, but they just don't realize that there were more Jews in the Middle East who were displaced than the Palestinians.
So let's have a look at this very disturbing table that looks at the numbers of Jewish people that fled countries in the Middle East and also North Africa. So, I mean, here we go. For example, if we take the top one, Michelle, we've got Algeria. So in 1948, there was 140,000 Jewish people in Algeria. Today, there's none. Egypt, there was 75,000 in 1948. Today, there's only 6. Iran had 100,000 Jewish people. Today there's only 8,000. Iraq, 150,000. Now there's only 3 Jews remaining. Lebanon is 20,000 with only 20 remaining. Libya had 38,000. Now only no Jewish people in Libya whatsoever. Morocco, 265,000. Now there's only 1,000. Syria had 30,000 Jews. Now they only have 3. Tunisia had 105,000 Jews, and today they have 1,000, and Yemen 63,000 Jews, but only 1 left. And also you got down the other table, which is really important, when those Jewish communities were established in the 1st and 2nd centuries, as you see from that list. But that really talks to me, and our viewers as well, probably watching as well, that amounts to ethnic cleansing.
Absolutely, absolutely.
That's genocide.
It was, absolutely. Those communities just don't exist anymore. You can go in Morocco, there's museums, but they've all gone. I mean, you've got the tourists who go to Morocco, but their communities dwindled. I remember when I first went to Morocco, which was I think 88 or something, 1988, and the community was at 8,000 then, but it's just dwindled down because all of the youngsters go to study in France and don't go back again. So it's a dwindling community. And all of those countries are the worse for it, and they know it. If you speak to the people on the street, they know by losing their Jewish communities, they have lost so much of their culture, their businesses. It changed it. All of the musicians, all of the artists, all of the business people, all of the people who built those countries and modernized them were the Jews, and they got rid of them, and they've suffered ever since.
No, absolutely. And also Poland as well is going down that same route as well, kind of mourning the loss of their Jewish communities as well.
Oh gosh, absolutely.
There is a price to pay for the persecution of the Jewish people, and it destroys those countries. And it says in Genesis 12, 1-3, I will bless those who bless you and I will curse those who curse you. So if you're a nation that curses the Jewish people, your land and your nation is going to be cursed.
It is so true. Those words in the Bible are so true.
So Michelle, going back, it's important to kind of put everything within its historical context. So we see that when Israel was declared its independence on the 14th of May 1948, over 75 years ago, it was then that Israel was invaded by 5 Arab armies who wanted to destroy her at birth. We saw that the leaders of the Arab world called on the Arab populations living under the British Mandate of Palestine, or what would then become the newly formed state of Israel, to get out of their homes, because the conquering Arab nations would liberate them and they could have their homes back. So most of the refugee crisis, you can actually say, was caused by bad Arab leadership. We also saw the leadership of the Palestinian Arabs going back in 1947. They rejected the UN partition plan of 47. So they've rejected the opportunity to live in peace with the Jewish community. They've rejected their own state. They supported 5 Arab armies when they actually invaded Israel. And then they had the audacity to blame Israel for the refugee crisis. And then they are permanently kept as refugees by not only UNRWA, but the surrounding Arab states, who refuse to absorb them into their own countries and use them as political pawns.
Absolutely, you've nailed it, and it's very tragic. It's very, very tragic, because it's very hard in those societies to break out of them, to be an independent thinker. It's very, very hard. You know, people learn to keep their voices down, even if they think it doesn't make sense. And for the people who didn't leave, when the state was announced and who didn't flee, they must have had enormous strength because they were really being called to leave and you can come back afterwards, and it didn't happen. And so there must be so much anger there against the leaders, but it's just never talked about. It's not out there. There's a louder narrative about how terrible the Jews are and how they've stolen our land and everything. And it's you know, social media has amplified the lies.
Absolutely. And of course also we see as well, for example, if I take, for example, the community, the Iraqi Jewish community, I mean, that goes back to the time of the Babylonians.
Yes, an amazing community.
And yet their government at the time after Israel's declaration of independence, the Iraqis had an army. They fought against Israel during a war of independence and then started to persecute its own Jewish population and then force them out. And yet they contributed to what was then modern Iraq and Iraqi life and society and everything else.
Very much so.
And literally their existence there was gone within a few weeks.
It's a very sad story of the Jewish people, whether you were born in Europe or in the Middle East, and you've been doing good for your community, science, the arts, whatever, and then you get stabbed in the back, literally. So, and it's tragic, but the amazing thing is, and I know so many in this Iraqi community, they pick themselves up. They pick themselves up. They don't harp on about it. They don't harp on about it. They've got on with their lives and have an optimism. You know, most love Israel, will have their holidays there, you know, the ones I know who live here. So it's a tragedy that keeps repeating itself. But I have absolute admiration for all of these communities, how they've picked themselves up.
So let's go and watch now the incredible story of the Jews from Iraq and how they were forced to flee during the creation of the modern state of Israel from 1948 to around 1952.
This story begins almost 3,000 years ago in Iraq. That's when the Bible tells how the Jewish people were exiled to Babylon, located some 60 miles from modern-day Baghdad. After the exile ended, many descendants stayed there for generations until the State of Israel was established in 1948.
One thing my mom told me, she said, when you leave Baghdad, never talk about the stuff that happened. Don't talk about it at all. She said, nobody wants to hear morbid stories because whatever happened was morbid. I told her, but why? I want everybody to know what we've been through if we survive, if we get out.
Filmmakers Carol Basri and Adriana Davis agreed the story needed to be told. Their documentary, Saving the Iraqi Jewish Archives, A Journey of Identity, tells how this Jewish community faced its own forced exodus from Iraq after more than 2,500 years. It sheds new light on the history of this community, the struggle to save the evidence of its existence, and the fight to keep the story alive.
I've learned that it's a much bigger issue than just things from the Iraqi Jews. It's also about the cultural and religious heritage of all ethnically cleansed people in the Middle East.
The archives, to me, became the sort of physical embodiment of the way the community was legally disseminated, because there is a legal precedent that detailed the laws that forced the Jewish community out. If you can't work and you can't go to school and you can't even hold money in the bank, you can't hold property, how are you to stay?
Due to this growing persecution, more than 160,000 Iraqi Jews began fleeing their homeland in 1952. Over the following decades, Saddam Hussein and the Iraqi government continued to punish the community by stripping property, seizing religious and cultural items, and purging personal records, including photographs.
I don't know if people understand that when the Iraqi Jews left their homeland of 2,700 years since the first temple, we were not allowed legally to take anything out of the country except 3 sets of clothes and 50 dinars, and you could take your wedding ring. That's it.
I'm trying to go abroad to continue my graduate studies and so on, and word came back to show up at the headquarters of the internal security. They ushered me into a room where they were taking somebody out who was already being interrogated, and it was all blood on his head and so on. It was a little bit of a frightening experience.
Fast forward to 2003, when during the Iraq War, the U.S. bombed the Mukhabarat secret police headquarters in Baghdad. Explosions ruptured the water system and flooded the basement. Based on an intelligence tip, Harold Rode, an Orthodox Jew working for the Pentagon, and others entered the building and found the collection of Jewish belongings underwater. With U.S. military help, they rescued nearly 20,000 personal and religious artifacts confiscated from the Jewish community, some hundreds of years old.
This whole project is a project of miracles. Hashem, God put me there. As far as I'm concerned, I was there to be there to help make this project work.
Items included Torah scrolls and prayer books, as well as documents of the Frank Eni School, the last Jewish school in Iraq. It closed in 1972, and its founder, Frank Eni, was Basri's grandfather.
The school that my grandfather founded was founded because of the Farhud, which was the pro-Nazi uprising in Iraq in 1941. Well, there was no Israel then.
The damaged artifacts were shipped to the National Archives in Washington for restoration.
In watching how that community left, to have miraculously found all this material, religious, cultural, personal material, to find all those items was to me the actual physical embodiment of the spirit of the Iraqi Jewish community.
The U.S. government's initial agreement indicated it would return the archives to Iraq, where there are just a handful of Jews left today. The State Department is trying to work out a new deal whereby the archives would stay in the U.S. The Jewish community is concerned that if it's returned, it will only be neglected or, worse, destroyed. And they say the items belong to them anyway. Iraq argues it wants to put the items on display as part of the country's national heritage.
I believe that the Iraqi Jewish story is an important story to tell, and it can only be told with the artifacts, the cultural and religious artifacts that are part of the Iraqi Jewish archives.
The filmmakers see the driving out of the Jews as the same kind of ethnic cleansing from which so many Christians in the Middle East have suffered during the last decade.
I believe that that is a universal story. It's not a Jewish story. As someone from not that background by birth, I understand the parallels to early Christians, or, even what's going on now. We just heard about it in the news when the Pope visited.
Davis says they need another miracle in order to keep the archives in the U.S. safe and accessible to tell the Iraqi Jewish story to generations to come. Julie Stahl, CBN News, Jerusalem.
And amazing there to hear about the plight and the history of the Iraqi Jewish community. And special thanks goes to my good friend there, Dr. Harold Rode, formerly of the US Department of Defense, an amazing, incredible guy. I was very touched by that. I've known Dr. Harold Rode for an awful long time, been very much a mentor. It's helped me grow and develop my knowledge of Israel and the Middle East, which enabled me to do this program. So you meet some very special people across your life, and he's definitely one of them. And Michelle, we have to talk about this in the context of what the Palestinian Arabs call the Nakba, which they mark that day when they see that this meant the dispersion of their own people. But we have to ask, why is it that 75 years on, UNRWA, which is the refugee agency that looks solely after the Palestinian people, wasn't disbanded 74 or 73 years ago and has perpetually kept the conflict alive generation after generation after generation, and how they want to use this as a weapon, the right of return, so that they can say that their ancestors have a right to come back to modern day Israel and to live in the homes that their ancestors lived when they were told to flee during Israel's War of Independence, would effectively destroy Israel as a nation state and a Jewish state.
Well, they're the only community that actually can pass on their refugee status. And what's very revealing is for a lot of those communities, they didn't actually come from those areas. They were like second generation, first generation, because when the Jews started coming back in the 1880s, they started rebuilding the country and they created lots of work. So a lot of those Arabs came from Syria, came from Egypt. I mean, Yasser Arafat's family were from Cairo. He was born in Cairo. He wasn't actually born there. And I think it was actually the older families who did have their roots there who stayed, whereas, I mean, it's difficult to know individually, but it's very, very complex, and it just doesn't make sense why this is the only community that do not, that haven't been settled, because, you know, if they've come to England, they get British passports. If you've gone to America, you get an American passport. But in the Arab countries, they're not given passports, they're not given nationalities. So they're just in limbo there. So this is something, I mean, I hope the Abraham Accords, because Israel's made peace with some of the surrounding countries, this is an important factor there that needs to be addressed.
Absolutely. And talking about that, I suppose the other aspect to add for this one is that Israel is accused of being an apartheid state, so-called because of the way it treats the Palestinian Arabs. But the reality of the fact is that the real apartheid is actually taking place in the Arab world, where Palestinian Arab refugees are considered third-class citizens in Jordan, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, where they are denied able to have a passport, not able to go to university, and they are constantly kept in poverty, essentially, to use as political pawns. And yet this is where the real discrimination. We're even seeing ethnic cleansing against Palestinian Arabs in Iraq as well, and yet the world silence and never talks about this.
The bombings in Syria,
refugee camps there as well.
Totally.
So we also need to hold the other Arab nations account, not only for their treatment of the Jewish people and their ancient Jewish communities, but also for their treatment of the Palestinian Arab refugees as well.
It's just a tool against Israel. It's a tool against, I mean, Israel is a Jewish state. It's a tool against the Jews. It really is. It's very, very painful for the surrounding Arab countries to see a Jewish state there, especially when, you see, once it's been under Muslim rule, it's forever Muslim in their eyes. So it's very, very painful, and they're just doing everything to eradicate the state. So therefore, to give those citizens, to give them citizenship in their countries, those Palestinians, they are helping. They're not going to, they want Israel removed from the Middle East. That's the bottom line. They want Israel removed, the Jews removed from the Middle East. You hear them say, why can't they go back to Poland and everything? And like we were talking in the beginning, we are not from Poland. We are from this region. You know, Absolutely. Our DNA tells us the names, you know, Judea. Judea is where the Jews come from.
Absolutely. And the Jewish people are the indigenous people of the Middle East. And that also explains why the Middle East is so successful. But when we also talk about the Sephardi community that resettled in Israel and the huge cost that Israel had to endure during those early days of the foundation of the state to absorb those 750,000 Jewish refugees.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
And for a number of years, they were left in tents until accommodation
poverty.
Could be found.
I mean, you know, a lot of the towns in Israel used to be transit towns. Places like Ashdod was just a transit town, whereas now it's a thriving, beautiful city. But all of these places, they were places that these Jews didn't even want to live in when they arrived. They all thought they were going to Jerusalem, and there was a massive disappointment and anger being sent to these small transit towns miles away.
But why do you think Israel just got on with it? And why do you think the Sephardi communities, those Jews from North Africa and the Middle East, just got on with life? Didn't complain about their situation, didn't complain about the loss of businesses and homes and finances and tradition and family, but just immersed themselves into Israeli life and culture.
What was interesting, because I've interviewed a lot of people about this, and you know, they talk about it now, how difficult it was, but they said when we arrived and we wanted to complain how difficult everything was, we saw the survivors from the Holocaust, who were like skin and bones. They'd lost all their families, they were lost souls. How could we complain? That's what I hear all the time from that older generation. We couldn't complain because we knew that we were lucky to be alive, and we were going to work hard, and our children were going to benefit even if we were going to suffer. It's a story I've heard so many times. So, you know, the Holocaust affected everybody, even if it didn't affect you directly, it affected those Jews too. When they saw the victims, they couldn't complain.
That's incredible. But even then, it wasn't until really the 1980s that Israel itself came to terms with the Holocaust, and Holocaust survivors in Israel started to begin to tell their story. So even then, at the early development of the modern state, the narrative of the Holocaust just wasn't used. Maybe it was the motivating factor to defend the Jewish people during those major wars that Israel faced, but it wasn't part of the national psyche. I think
generally how trauma's dealt with has changed. You know, PTSD didn't exist then. You know, that term wasn't known, even though today it exists. So it's moved on.
And I suppose the other big question as well is that in this programme, and you've done a fantastic job, Michelle, of highlighting the plight of the forgotten Jewish refugees of the Middle East and North Africa, and to think that 850,000 of these ancient Jewish communities were dispersed within a few years and that chart we saw, to very few. What is the end goal? Is it recognition of what happened? Is it to get compensation? Or is it to set an historic wrong and put it right?
Well, it's a bit of all of that. It would be fantastic to get compensation, but I always say I wouldn't hold out for it. Although some people have been able to get compensation from countries that had a Nazi occupation. They've been able to get compensation from Germany. I know some people from Tunisia who've managed to get compensation. However, it's definitely the reconciliation for all sides being part of the narrative. We're trying to change the narrative to the reality. You know, anybody who goes to Israel knows you're in the Middle East, you're not in Poland, you're not, forget about the sunshine, but the whole culture, the music that people listen to, the foods that people eat, and it's that population that have changed it. It is the Jews from the Middle East and North Africa who have changed the culture. Israel today is over 6 million, so over half of that,
over 9 million.
Yes, sorry, you're right, over 9 million, but over 6 million Jews. And so of that 6 million, you've got over 3 million who've come from the Middle East and North Africa. So the fact that they brought their culture into the mainstream, and it's the dominant culture now, very much so.
And Michelle, would you say there is a correlation between what happened to the plight of the Jews from the Middle East and North Africa to what's happened to the ancient Christian communities over the last couple of decades, have faced ethnic cleansing across the region?
Very much so, and it's the same story, it's not part of the narrative. It's not part of the narrative. There's certain communities that hog the media, and there's others, you know, what goes on with Christians around the world just does not make the mainstream, and it's tragic. So again, it needs people to be speaking out. I know we have done with Harif, we've done joint events with the Christian Pakistani community a few years ago, and we're always happy to join up.
Yeah, because one thing's quite amazing, whether it's Christian converts from Islam in the Middle East or whether it's a lot of Christian communities in the Middle East, a lot of them have a tremendous love for Israel, and they want to speak up for Israel because they understand Israel within not only the kind of understanding the Bible, but also understand it culturally and also regionally as well about what's happening in the Middle East. And they are becoming some of Israel's most incredible allies and advocates.
That's right, that's right. But it's very hard for people to speak up because their families can suffer, and it's very, very hard when it comes back to you and it comes back to your families who are still living in these communities as Muslims. You might have converted, but it's still very, very difficult. And I have all my sympathies for those people who leave but understand how hard it is for them to speak out because, of course, they love their families and it's a very difficult thing to do.
And to share with us a little bit of how difficult life is with the very small communities in the Middle East left. How difficult is it, for example, for the Jewish community in Iran, or probably still living in Tehran, who are fearful of the state? They are seen as spies on behalf of Israel.
You don't mention the I word.
Yeah.
You don't mention the I word. You just don't mention Israel. It's impossible to, because it just flares people up because of what has been channeled through to them through modern media. There is a drip, or I'd say a boom of Israel hatred. And so it's really, people have been indoctrinated with Israel hatred, and it's very hard to combat it.
Yeah. As we just going along a line of thinking that we're discussing this program, what would it have been like for those 850,000 Jews from the Middle East and North Africa who were effectively ethnically cleansed from their homelands during the creation of the modern state of Israel, had Israel not been there? Some would argue that if it wasn't for the state of Israel, these ancient Jewish communities would still be in the Middle East. But Israel has acted as a safeguard, as a protector of the Jewish people around the world. So what would have the situation been like if these Jews from the North Africa and the Middle East had nowhere to go?
Well, they've had loads of pogroms in all of these countries. You know, there was the Fahud in 1941. There was no state of Israel then. All through the various different communities, there have been pogroms all the time. You know, people have had to keep their heads down. They haven't been able to speak out. When you're Jewish, because you're fearful, you haven't had somewhere to run to. That's your country. You know, that's where all of your ancestors have lived for hundreds of years. You don't know any different, but you're aware of the fact that you're different, and you're aware of the fact that you have to keep a low profile. But after the formation of the State of Israel, though, it was just much harder, much harder with their neighbors, and they were treated as spies, traitors.
With 5 minutes program, how can our viewers help you, Michelle, and your organisation Harif to get justice and recognition for what happened to the plight of the Sephardi Jews?
Well, at Harif, we've got lots of ways that we can help you. We've got a website, so go to our website, harif.org. You can show, we've got films that you can show to schools, to churches, to different communities. I find the Forgotten Refugees film by the David Project is a fantastic film. You can find it online, and it's just one of those films. It's just lots of testimonials from different families from across the communities and understanding of the background. It's a fantastic film to show. There's like a 15-minute version, there's a 1-hour version of it depending on the timing, so I would tell anybody if they get an opportunity for one of their groups to show it. We've got loads of literature. We've also got a sister website, Point of No Return, literally updated every single day. We share everybody's stories from across the whole region, and if you go on to Point of No Return, you've also got everything divided by countries, by eras. So if you're studying, it's a great place as point of reference. And there's a link to it on the Harif website as well.
Amazing. And what's being done politically? Because also it's important that our members of parliament know exactly what happened, particularly our Foreign Office. So whenever the discussion comes up about the Palestinian Arab refugee crisis, and it's imperative, isn't it, to then have the moral equivalent and say, well, we need to also remember what happened to the Jewish communities.
Totally, absolutely. Plus, 30th of November, which we're commemorating and we ask everybody else to commemorate, is a great opportunity. So when we're sharing information, 30th of November is a great way to gather people together. Skeptics as well. I mean, I've shown that film to some very hostile crowds. I've shown it and they've all said, we didn't know this. Nobody told us this. This is Middle Eastern Muslims who've seen that film and they're feeling like, well, why doesn't anybody talk about this? Why didn't anybody tell us this story?
Yeah, which is a story that needs to be heard as well. And Michelle, just finally, just share with us some of the incredible music, the incredible food, some of the incredible festivals and traditions that goes with the Sephardi community or the Jews from North Africa and the Middle East.
Well, the food's fantastic, but every country has got its own specialities, and don't forget they had to mix the local cuisine and what was available with kosher dietary rules. So you're making things slightly differently. So you'll get, North African Jews who'll have couscous, tafina, different foods. And again, music's influenced by those countries. So there's a lot to discover.
Well, Michelle, thank you so much for being my special guest for this week's Middle East Report. You've done a great job, and thank you so much for bringing awareness of the plight of the Jews from North Africa and the Middle East.
It's been a pleasure being here. Thank you very much, Simon.
Well, I thank you very much for watching today's Middle East Report. I think it's absolutely vital that we become advocates and spread the awareness of what happened to the Jews from the Middle East and North Africa over 75 years ago. And it's an imperative that their story is told and they are not forgotten, and they get justice and compensation like they deserve. So I want to thank you for watching this week's edition of the Middle East Report.